Have you animated a project with OpenToonz and are interested in adding some of the effects that OpenToonz has? Well, that's exactly what I'll be doing today as we take our first look at adding effects in OpenToonz. Hello ladies and gents, and welcome to the final part of my animation process series. In the first 3 parts I covered putting the story together, building up a storyboard and transferring that to an animatic to set out the basic timing. Then I drew out the rough animation, detailing the difference between extremes, keyframes, breakdowns and in-betweens. And then last week I cleaned up the animation, inked in the clean lines and coloured it. You can see links to these in the description below. Well, today we'll take that finished animation and add some effects to make a more polished animation. As with all my videos, there are time codes in the description below so you can jump directly to the relevant section. So let's get started. Adding effects in OpenToonz is really straightforward once you understand the basics, and we'll go through those today. But first, it's handy to have a separate room to add the effects, and for that I'll repurpose the animation room. So first I'll rename the room Effects, and you do that by double clicking on the tab name there. So then I'll just reorder the panels for the best layout. Now I don't need the level strip, so you can simply click and drag that away from where it's docked, and then press the X in the corner to close it. And then I'll dock the other panels to a better location. To do so, you simply click on the header bar and drag it to the new location, and you'll see an orange line when it's ready to dock, and just release. And I'll just move the function editor to the side. And you'll notice that the frame numbers of the function editor, written down the left, align exactly with the frame numbers of the X sheet. And this is the main reason why I'm using the X sheet view instead of the timeline view. Now if you have the timeline view, you simply click the button in the top left to change between the two from timeline back to the X sheet. Now if your frame numbers don't align up like this, then you need to go to the Preferences, under File, go down to the X sheet section, and you'll want to tick the box that says Expand Function Editor Header to match the X sheet toolbar height. And you'll notice there's an asterisk at the side, which means that you have to restart OpenToonz before you see this in effect. So if you tick the box and then restart OpenToonz, you should then have your frame numbers aligned, which makes editing the effects much easier. So as you scroll through your animation, the effects line up with the animation frames. Okay. So my first tip once you've ordered the panels is to lock them in place by going to Windows and ticking Lock Room Panes. This stops the panels from accidentally being removed, so you can't click and drag them away from where they are, but you can still resize them, so you can see more of one of the panes. Most of the work for adding effects is done in either the schematic panel or in the function editor, and having the largest amount of space available is vital. So my next tip is how to share a panel full screen. You can either double click on the header bar of the panel, and then double click again to restore it, or you can press the backward single quote key, which on a standard Microsoft keyboard is to the left of the number 1 key, and that makes the panel where your pointer is full screen. So move your pointer over whichever panel you want to see large and press the key. And you can of course change this key in the keyboard shortcuts page. Okay, so let's take a look at the schematic panel. So the schematic panel shows 2 different views which you can change with the button at the bottom right here. First is the effects schematic, which is what we'll be using today, and if you click it you'll also see the stage schematic, and this shows how the columns relate to each other, and at the minute they're all individual columns just connected to the table. So we'll go back to the effects schematic, and here you can see all the columns attached to the X sheet. They're different colours because they're different types of columns. The blue nodes show the raster levels, which we're not going to add any effects to, as they were here to show the setting up of the animation, so we'll move these out of the way. And the ledge and titles are no longer used, so we'll move those out of the way as well. So it just leaves 4 nodes. So I'll move these to the centre. So the way I'm moving the nodes is I'm simply highlighting them by dragging a box around them and then clicking and dragging. And to move the main screen, you use the middle mouse button. Now I'm using a tablet, so I programmed one of my tablet's pen buttons to be the middle mouse button, and simply click it and move it around without touching the tablet. So let's give you a quick tour around the nodes. You'll notice there's two sets of words on the node. The first one is the layer name, which is shown at the top here, so where it says Neat Sack. That's the first line there. And the second line is the level name, which I happen to have used the same name. And you can see that shown here below, Neat Sack 1. Then at the top right are two buttons. The very top one, if you click it, takes this level out of the final render, and is the equivalent of clicking the eyeball on the layer to turn it off. And the second button is the equivalent of clicking the table button on the layer, which removes the drawings from the current preview. And you can either click it here on the layer or in the schematic. So we'll turn both those back on. And at the bottom right is a blue arrow, which shows the output from this layer going directly to the X sheet. If you click and drag over that line, it highlights it in blue, and you can press the delete key, and that removes it from the output. So to connect it again, you simply click and drag from the blue arrow to the input of the X sheet. And finally, if I reposition the 4 nodes, like this, and if I click the button in the top left, you'll see a preview of what's in that layer, which can help when trying to work out what each node is when the names aren't very clear. But being there's only 4 layers, I think we can cope without them today. Okay, so there are 2 types of effects, those that affect the whole scene and those that affect a specific column. So for example, you can add a coloured background by adding a colour card. So if I just hide the background from the view there, then right click and choose Add Effects. I can also click the Effects button at the bottom right to bring up the effects browser, and on the background I can choose to add a colour card. Add. And that appears on the schematic and in the X sheet as another level node. So I'll close that down. And the results of the effects aren't shown in the table view until you turn on the preview mode. So let's do that. I'll just resize the window there. And the preview mode button is the eyeball on the table toolbar. So if you click that, and you'll see the green colour card. Now it's currently to the right of the sack and the trees, so it goes in front of them. So if we click and drag that back to the left, it'll sit behind the trees and the sack. And to change the colour as you would any other effect, you just double click on the node, and then you can see any options that you can change. And all we can change here is the colour, which you can either type numbers into the boxes, click and drag the sliders, or double click on the colour swatch. So we'll pick a different colour there to red, and it's as simple as that. And you'll also notice this key button at the left hand side, and this is so you can keyframe these settings and change them over time. So for instance, if on frame 1, which you can click in either the function editor or on the X sheet, you can then add a key which sets the background as orange, and you can see this is set because the key button is highlighted, and also in the function editor at the right hand side you can see all of the levels listed and all of the effects that you've added. At the minute there's only 1. And if you click on the folder, it'll expand and show you all the columns that you can edit. And that's the 3 main colours and the alpha. And these are set as keys on frame 1. Now typically what we'll be doing today is set a key value on a frame, and if you want the same key value to hold over a period of time, you then click on the frame you want it to hold to, click the key button again, which takes a copy of those values, and then when you want it to change, you simply move to the new frame and then adjust them, either using the sliders, as was said before, and pressing the key button, or if we go down to the second frame, you can simply change it using the swatch to a bright green. Okay, I'm pressing the key button again and you'll see them appear. So if we take a look at that and play that animation, and you see it playing quite slowly as we calculate each frame's value, and this is generally why we don't leave the preview button turned on. So the colours stay the same at the very beginning, then they change to the second colour, and then they'll change to the third colour, and remain in that colour through to the end of the animation. So we use the preview button while we set up an effect, but generally we'll turn it off and play by using the preview window, which you can find under File, Preview, or press Ctrl R. And if I skip to the first frame, you'll see it's calculating all of the frames. Once it's set to black, you can then fit the animation to the window and then hit play. and you'll see the same colour changes more smoothly. There we go. Okay, so let's remove this colour card by right clicking and choosing cut. And that's gone. And bring back the main background. There we go. Okay, so let's add some effects to the drawings themselves. So the effects I'd like to add are, firstly, when you move close to the flower sack, I'd like the trees to be slightly blurred out. When the flower sack jumps into the air, I'd like some motion blur as he moves upwards because he's moving quite quickly. I want to add a shadow beneath the sack as he's standing still and as he moves, and shadows beneath the trees. And I want to add a small bit of blur to the puffs of smoke that come out when the sack lands, and to make them fade out a little bit. And to add some interest into the background, I'm going to add a sun and add some glow. So let's get started. So to walk through the first effect, I'm going to add a blur effect to the trees only when we're close up. So this comes in here at frame 37, and you'll notice if I click frame 37, on the trees layer the node text is highlighted in yellow, so you can see which node you're working with and which column. So first things first, let's turn on the preview mode, and then we'll see when the effect is added. So we right click on the tree node and choose Insert FX, and from the blur menu we choose the standard blur. And by inserting the effect, it inserts in between the line from the trees to the X sheet. So the full output from the trees node is used for the blur effect, and only the output of the blur is shown on the X sheet. And you can see immediately that the trees are blurred out. Now because we want the trees to be in focus from the first frame up to 36 and only go blurred from 37, we need to put a keyframe on frame 36 to show the trees without the blur. Otherwise they would show blurred here as well. So if we go to frame 36 and then double click on the blur effect, you'll see that the value is 9.5mm. Now this relates to some camera setting or other, so ignore the fact it says millimeters and just treat it as a number. So no blur at all, needs to be 0, so we click in there and type 0 and press enter, and you'll see the tree is immediately back in focus. So what we need to do is to add a key for the 0 value, so we click the key button, and we can see that in the function editor by taking a look over here at the effects listed. Currently there's only one for the blur one. If you open that up, you'll see there's only one value, so tick that box and you'll see it's set to 0. So if we go down to frame 37, which remember we can do in either the function editor or on the X sheet, and then set the blur we actually do want to have. So let's put 3mm in and see how that looks. If you press the key button, it sets a value in the function editor, and then we get to see it in the preview window. I think slightly more blurred would be useful. So there's a few ways you can change this value. You can either click in the text box and just type in a number 4 and press enter, and you'll notice it changing the function editor. Or you can click and drag just below and there's a little line, and then drag it to the right to go higher and left to go smaller. Or you can double click in the function editor window itself and just type the figure direct into the cell. Okay, so we want this blurred value to last until the camera zooms out. So let's scroll down here, and I can see exactly where it is because we go back to frame 1. So you can see on the frame before, 96, we're still zoomed in. On 97, we zoom out. So if we go to 96, I want to reapply the same key so that for the whole period of while the camera is close up, the value stays at 4. And on the next frame, 97, we want the value to go back to 0. And again, we can just enter 0 in here and press the key button, or you can double click into this cell and then type 0 and press enter. And that sets the key as well. And you might wonder why we need to type 4 into the final cell when we've already set 4 at the beginning, and that's because if we didn't, so if I click and delete that cell, you'll see it automatically adds a transition from one keyframe to the next. So it goes from 4 down through to 3, through 2s, through the 1s, down to 0. So to hold a single value, you've got to have a key at the start of the range and the same key at the end. So it shows us 4 all the way through. So let's just save that and take a quick look by pressing Ctrl R to get to the preview window. Fit to window, start at the first frame, so the trees are in focus, and as I click play, you'll see they stay in focus until you go close up when they're blurred, and then go back to being in focus when we step out again. Okay, so that's the first effect done. So despite the long explanation of how you set up an effect and all the possible ways you can edit it, it's really quite a simple process. You right click on a level, you choose Insert Effects, you choose the effect that you want. You then move to the right frame to apply the effect. Double click on the effect to see the options. Press the key button or type in the function editor. And then move to the end frame and type the same number if you want to keep the effect the same, or a different number if you want it to change over time. It's as simple as that. And if you make a mistake, click and drag over the cells in the function editor and then tap the delete key. And then start again. So I'll put this back to 0. So that's it for the blur on the trees. So I want to add a similar effect to the flower sack as it first jumps up by adding a motion blur, but I'll choose a slightly different one to have a directional motion blur. Let's see how that looks. So by looking at the frames of the flower sack, I can see this is where it jumps. And if I turn off the preview button, I can then scroll down, so that's where it jumps. So what I want to do is add a blur as soon as it leaves the ground here on frame 136 until it reaches the top of the jump. Okay. So we find the flower sack in the schematic, we right click and choose Insert Effects, and inside Blur I'm going to choose Directional Blur. So you choose the directional blur when your character is moving in one direction and you want the blur to go in the opposite. So as we jump up, we want the blur to follow on from behind, so it'll be shown beneath the flower sack, not above it. Now this effect will only last for a few seconds, so it won't be very noticeable, but it just adds that little bit of finish to the animation. Okay, so on frame 135 we don't want any blur, so we'll take this down to 0 and we'll add a key for the intensity and for the angle. And again, to take a look at the values in the function editor, we'll untick the previous blur and we'll tick the intensity and angle for the new directional blur. So you can see there's 0 on frame 135. So that means on the frames leading up to here, they'll stay 0. Then on frame 136 onwards, we want the angle to be, I believe, minus 90 degrees. In intensity, again, I'll just pick a number 5. And now press the key button and it sets those into the function editor. And if we click the preview button, we'll see how that looks. So let's just zoom in a little bit. Okay, so it's not set the angle there, so let's change that to minus 90 again. There we go, and I can see it's changed over here in the function editor. And immediately you can see the blur is trailing backwards from the sack. So we'll make the intensity slightly larger, so we'll put it up to 10. And that helps show the direction that the flower sack is moving in. So let's see how many frames we want this to last for. And again, as we go to each frame, it has to calculate the view, so it takes a little while to draw it. And let's just zoom out a little bit. Right, so it's curling up already, so it's only the first couple of frames there to 139. So again, we'll just pop a key of the same value on 139, and that keeps the value the same over that period. Then on frame 140, we want these to go down to 0. And it's just as easy to type them in than to use this dialog. Okay, so for those few frames, we've got some motion blur. So let's save and take a look at the preview. Okay, it has a little effect there. Let's just try increasing it and seeing if that looks silly. So let's change this value here. Intensity, let's double it again up to 20. Doesn't make too much difference. Let's take a look at that. Okay, that's fine. We'll leave it at that. Okay, so next I just wanted to add the sun glowing. So I'll just add that and then we'll take a quick look at the effect afterwards. Okay, so I've added the glow effect, and you can find that by right clicking, going to Insert Effects, Light, and then Glow. I've inserted the sun as the light and as the source, and I've changed all 4 values, so I've made it a brighter glow, I've made the glow to be slightly orange, I've given it a larger blur, which affects how far the light moves away from the sun, and I've increased the fade. Let's make that higher. Yep, so you get a bit more of an orange glow. Okay. And you may have noticed I drew the sun on frame 1 and exposed it through to frame 36, which is the final frame when we're zoomed out, and then when you go to frame 37 it's hidden so you can't see it, and then reappears again when we go to the wider view. So now we've got a sun, we can add some shadows. And in the same way we added the sun as a new drawing on a new layer and added the effect to that layer, we'll be doing the same with the shadows. So I'll add a new layer for the shadows under the trees, and then we'll add the effects to that. Okay, so that's the basic shadows drawn, we can always change them later. So what I want to do is to add 2 types of effects to these shadows. First one's the basic blur effect, and that's just to make the outside of the ellipses blur into the ground, so they haven't got such a crisp edge. And then a transparency effect to make the shadows less harsh. So I'll add those in now. So let's add the blur effect. I'll leave it at the default value for now, then after the blur effect, I'll insert again layer blending, transparency. And that's it between the blur and the final output. So you see immediately that the shadow went paler, and that's because the transparency starts off at 50%. So bring the value down to make it darker, so it's less transparent. So 0 is no transparency at all, up to 100, which is fully transparent. Okay, so we don't want them too harsh. If you wanted to, you could break up the shadows for the trees and the bushes, so that the bushes' shadows look darker because they're nearer to the ground than the trees. But for this simple example, I'll leave them all on the same layer. So next we'll do the same thing for the flower sack, only this time we'll move the shadow as the flower sack moves. So let me just set up the shadow now. Okay, so that's the basics of the shadow underneath the flower sack. So all I've done is drawn 2 different sized ellipses, one for when the sack is at a distance, and then a second for when we've got a close-up of the sack. So I've changed the blur and transparency because the flower sack is actually touching the floor, so you want to see the shadow a bit clearer. And because of course the character's in the foreground and you want to emphasise it a lot more as well. So what we need to do now to make this work is that as the flower sack moves, I need to animate the shadow as well. And we'll do that using the Animate tool. I won't go into all the details of the Animate tool today, but I'll show you briefly how I'd do it. So the first 36 frames are fine because the sack doesn't move, so we don't need to do anything with that. On frame 37, we'll go close in, and you can see here on frame 55, there's some animation of the sack. If I turn off the preview it'll be quicker. As the sack leans backwards, and then back to being forwards further down, I'd like to animate the shadow slightly to move with him. So what we're going to do is use the Animate keys similar to how we used the Effect keys earlier. So we want the shadow to stay still up to this point on frame 54, and to do that we use the key button here beneath the table. So first you move to the shadow level into the exact cell you need, then you click the key button and notice the key appears in the X sheet. And also in the function editor you can see the sack shadows level is highlighted in red. So if you expand that And you can choose which values are shown in the function editor so you can follow them changing. It's also going to resize using the scale options, so we'll show the east-west and north-south values, and we'll show the 3 scale values too. So let's make that slightly wider so we can see all of them. Here we go. So because we clicked the key before we changed any values, they're at their default setting, which is position 0, 0 of where the shadow was drawn, and the scale at 100%. So before we start animating, the first thing we need to do is set the centre of the shadow, and to do that you simply drag on the screen until this marker appears in the centre of the object you want to alter. And this is so when you scale, it'll expand and shrink around this centre point here. Okay, so in the animation we can see the sack leans backwards until frame 59 when it's at its full extent. What we need to do using the Animate tool is to move the shadow to its final position. So I want to make it scale slightly larger, so just click and drag on the screen. And then also want to change the position to the left a little bit. And you'll see it's changed the values. East and west, which is left and right, and north-south has moved slightly, but we don't really want it to, we want it to go to the left. So we'll double click that and put it back to 0. And that means it'll no longer move up and down. Or we can click and drag over the cells and delete all but the first. And doing that makes it easier to see what's in the function editor as well. Finally, the scale's gone from 100% to 112%. So if we take a look at that animation, so if we drag to see the animation, you'll see the shadows going to the left, expanding to the left, but I'd like the front to move to the left. So we'll change the position a bit more to the left, about there. Okay, so as the sack leans back, the shadow moves back with him, and then when the sack comes back forward, we want the shadow to come back forward as well. You can see the sack frames here, from frames 83 through to 37 where he leans forward. So what I want to do is have exactly the same animation of the shadow coming forward as it did when going back. So I'll literally copy and paste the animation frames. So if we click and drag over the last 2 frames here, if I copy that and then go to frame 82 and do paste, so that's using the keyboard shortcuts Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, and then as he starts to move we need the animation to start to move. So I'll go back to the first frame, I want to copy these and paste them on the final frame of the animation, which is 37 there. Paste. And as we're not using the horizontal and vertical scales separately, or the north and south, I'll delete those keys from there and take them off the screen like that. Okay, so the shadow's at the back, and then when they come to lean forward, the shadow moves forward with it. And then stays where it is forward until we're back on the zoomed out screen again. Okay, so I'll apply a similar technique to the shadow as the sack jumps onto the ledge, and then come back in a second. Good, that looks okay. So just a couple of things to point out. I've tried to change the size of the shadow as the sack moves up and down. So you see it growing larger as the sack bends over, and then goes smaller when it jumps into the air and goes further away from the ground. And secondly, I've just deleted a few of the frames on the shadow as it moves from the ground to on the ledge. But if you wanted it to look more realistic, you draw the shadow going up the side of the ledge until it reaches the top. But for the quick demo today, that's not really necessary. So the final thing I'd like to add effects to is the puffs of smoke when the sack lands. So let's take a look at that. And here they are. So at the minute they're quite cartoony with the black outline, so I want to remove that. I also want to make them slightly blurred, so they haven't got such a distinct shape, and then use the invisibility effect to make the smoke fade out a little bit. Okay, so firstly let's move the black lines around the edge of the smoke. We'll do that by choosing the selection tool, and we'll go to each frame of the smoke, select the circle, and just change the colour to the grey colour. Okay, so now I'll just add the effects. Good. And although I didn't spend a lot of time on the background, adding these effects has added a little something extra that you wouldn't have got with hand drawing alone. It helps to make the animation pop some more, and the effect of the puffs of smoke is now much more subtle. So here it is in full. We've taken quite a while to talk through how to add the effects, but in reality I could have added all of these in just 5 or 10 minutes, so it's definitely worth the time spent learning how to do them. So go ahead and experiment with adding effects to your own animations. And why not subscribe, as I'll be back each Friday with more tutorials and animations. And that's a guarantee.